Russia is blessed with some of the world's most stunning landscapes and vast natural resources. But despite all that, many people there are deeply unhappy. And the data backs it up. Russia has the world's fifth highest suicide rate at 24.1 per 100,000. And that's only the national average. In some regions, the numbers are even more alarming. Why is life in one of the world's most resource-rich nations so incredibly hard for so many? Let's take a closer look. According to the Washington, D.C.-based think tank Freedom House, Russia ranks as one of the least free countries in the world. But what does that actually mean? Well, it starts with censorship. And a lot of it. Yes, the Russian constitution technically guarantees freedom of speech, but there's a big, convenient loophole. The government gets to crack down heavily on anything it considers an expression of extremism. Over time, that definition has been expanded, allowing authorities to suppress dissent, restrict independent journalism, and silence opposition voices. This control over expression has drawn direct comparisons to North Korea, where state narratives dominate and the media operates under near total government oversight. Under Vladimir Putin's regime, almost every major media outlet in Russia is either state-run or heavily regulated. The most popular network in Russia is Channel 1. It's a public-private partnership between the Russian government and a group of investors, but in practice, it operates more like a mouthpiece for the Kremlin. Every major investor tied to the channel is closely aligned with Putin's regime, and the coverage reflects that. But what about other channels? NTV is the second most popular in the country, but its content carries a very similar tone to Channel 1. That's because it's controlled by Gazprom, the state-owned energy giant with deep ties to the Kremlin. Then there's Russia 1, which rounds out the top broadcasters. It's owned by the all-Russian State Television and Radio Broadcasting Company, VGTRK, a government-run entity. In other words, Russia's top 3 networks are all tightly linked to the state, and their messaging rarely strays from the official line. Western audiences are likely familiar with Russia Today, RT, the country's English-language network. While it operates on a smaller scale compared to domestic giants like Channel 1 or Russia 1, RT is still fully funded by the Russian government. This level of control doesn't stop at television. It extends to radio as well. Gazprom is in the radio business too. It owns Avtoradio, the second most popular station in the country. In fact, nearly all major radio stations in Russia are either state-owned or controlled by Kremlin-aligned corporations. And when it comes to print media and newspapers, the story's no different. The state or its allies control the narrative. So if you've ever wondered why Russia rarely produces globally recognized films, shows, or books, this is a big part of the reason. Creativity struggles in an environment built on censorship. That's the reality of life in Russia. Citizens are forced to consume media they don't trust. Only 35% of Russians believed what they were seeing on Channel 1 in 2023, and that was the most trusted channel. The Kremlin's reach extends deep into the digital world. YouTube remains accessible, for now, but the experience is a far cry from what Western users are used to. The platform runs agonizingly slow, making it nearly impossible to watch anything. And there's a reason for that. The Kremlin limited YouTube's bandwidth in the summer of 2024, so traffic dropped to 20% of its normal levels by the end of the year. But that's not all. In November of 2024, Google's parent company Alphabet was fined $20 decillion for refusing to reinstate pro-Russian YouTube channels. That isn't a fine the company intends on paying, not least of which because it's 200 quintillion times larger than the entire global economy. We're not making that up. But it doesn't matter. Google's Russian subsidiary was declared bankrupt in 2022 anyway, so if anyone already owns an Android phone in Russia, they might be fine for now, but getting a new one, that's a different story. Just in case you were wondering, it's a similar situation with Apple. When it comes to internet browsing, most searches are now routed through Russia's own Yandex, a platform that comes with a very noticeable pro-Kremlin slant. Social media networks face similar problems. Facebook? Instagram? No to either. They were blocked after Putin decided to launch his special military operation. Their parent company Meta was labeled an extremist organization. No $20 decillion fine yet, but that could come any day now. X blocked as well. It's unlikely that this situation will change anytime soon. However, there is one show in Russia that isn't censored, the show about Russian politics. And that's not good news. While Russia maintains the pretense of fair and democratic elections, the reality tells a very different story. Yes, people can go to polling places, those are real, but they're also part of a carefully staged performance. Legitimate election observers are heavily restricted, with Putin's regime limiting how many can even enter the polling stations. And yes, there are advertisements for opposition parties, but that's part of the illusion too. In fact, there are too many. That's because Putin gets to hand-pick his opposition, and he's chosen plenty. Among them are the Communist Party, A Just Russia, the Liberal Democratic Party of Russia, and the New People Party. These parties won a combined total of 118 seats in the Duma in 2021. Putin's regime relaxed party registration rules in 2012 to encourage hundreds of other parties to emerge. That sounds like freedom. Sounds being the key word. So many parties competing with each other means that genuine opposition remains divided, and most parties stay small. But some of these minority parties managed to break through. In 2021, 3 new parties, New People, For Truth, and Green Alternative, got enough support to qualify for elections to the Duma. But as you might expect, there's always a catch. All these so-called opposition parties have something in common. Their leaders and chairs have ties with Putin's United Russia Party. Opposition parties and candidates that actually exist outside of the show Putin stages conveniently get disqualified. The most famous in the wider world was Alexei Navalny, but he wasn't unique. Figures outside of the official show of Russian politics can expect to see themselves harassed or be declared as extremists. The demonization is the most obvious part. Whenever there's an arrest or indictment of a true opposition figure, Russians will hear about it in whatever form of media they prefer to consume. But this kind of censorship isn't unique to Russia. China shares many of the same tactics, but with one major difference. China doesn't even bother to go through with the political stagecraft that Russia does. There aren't fake elections, and its censorship on the internet through the use of its Great Firewall is even more in your face. And yet, its suicide rate among citizens is 9.17 per 100,000. Why? One explanation is that the Chinese government has made a deal with its people in exchange for this. It still rules them in a heavy-handed way, but guarantees economic growth in exchange. And it's succeeded. Around 800 million people have emerged from poverty since the country opened up to the world in 1978. China's median salary is about $4,000 a month. So far, the Communist Party has lived up to the promise it made. Russia never made any such promise. Life has always been difficult for the average Russian worker, but in recent years, conditions have worsened significantly. Those seeking to understand the reasons behind this growing hardship face real risks. The truth isn't easily found in mainstream media, and under current Russian law, disseminating what the government defines as knowingly false information about the so-called special military operation can result in up to 15 years in prison. As a result, much of the reality remains obscured. Putin's invasion of Ukraine made Russia the world's most sanctioned country, exceeding even North Korea and Iran. This might seem surprising, especially given the continued wealth and security enjoyed by President Vladimir Putin and those in his inner circle. But this stark contrast reflects the nature of the Russian political and economic system. Even before the war in Ukraine, Russia stood out on the global economic stage. Despite ranking as the world's 11th largest economy overall, that wealth isn't enjoyed by everyone. The World Bank lists Russia's 2023 nominal GDP per capita at just under $13,900. That's far below the United States at almost $83,000, but it's also below the likes of Andorra, China, or even Costa Rica. So why are people in Russia not making more money? The most important part of the Russian economy by far is the energy sector. It makes up 20% of the country's yearly GDP, but for the people who work in it, the pay isn't what they might expect for such an important job. In early 2024, workers in Russia's oil and gas sector made around $1,400 a month on average. That's two-thirds higher than the national average, but their American counterparts in the same sector make nearly 5.6 times more on average, almost $7,700. And with over 3 years of war, even the energy jobs in Russia are starting to lose their competitiveness. The Russian military is so short on manpower that it's offering signing bonuses of about $2,400 and monthly salaries of about $2,600. And yet, that's still lower than the American median salary of just under $4,800. This economic imbalance is also reflected in Russia's broader industrial profile. Energy products easily dominate the country's exports, with agriculture trailing behind. Beyond the energy sector, Russia's largest corporations are Sberbank and resource giants like MMC Norilsk Nickel (PJSC), a major supplier of nickel and palladium. Yet despite its vast size and natural wealth, Russia has not emerged as a leader in advanced global industries. Globally recognized Russian brands are few, if any exist at all, and that trend shows little sign of changing. For those seeking careers at prestigious or forward-thinking companies, the most attractive opportunities continue to be found outside Russia's borders. In earlier years, that path remained open to many Russians, a symbol of the Cold War's end and the promise of a new era of global opportunity. At least, that was the idea. It was supposed to mark a turning point. The United States has some of the world's wealthiest and most recognizable companies. Just look at what it exports. There's a broad selection including energy and agricultural products, but also automobiles, medical equipment, advanced electronics, and even artistic products like antiques and paintings. That's because it has tech giants like Apple and Microsoft, entertainment behemoths like Disney, premier automotive companies like Ford, GM, and too many other brands to name. A lot of them came into Russia after 1991 to do business. The transition was a tough one for Russia, but at least there was always hope on the other side because of the presence of those companies. But now, over 1,000 international businesses have either curtailed or shut down their operations in Russia. The picture was steadily growing worse as Putin boasted about the annexation of Crimea, but the special military operation shut business with the West off. There are still foreign companies operating in Russia though, and they're based in the country you'd expect. China has a far more diverse economy than Russia. Sure, it's the world's manufacturing leader, but there are a lot more jobs available now outside of the factory. China has telecom leaders like Huawei and a booming electric car industry led by companies such as BYD. There's even TikTok, owned by China's ByteDance. There's evidence that these companies are doing some hiring in Russia, but that's a double-edged sword. Since there's a lot of talent available with the exit of Western firms, they're cashing in, which probably means lower wages than before. Unsurprisingly, people voted with their feet and left the country. The special military operation resulted in a brain drain as hundreds of thousands of the most educated countrymen fled abroad to avoid a military draft. This exodus of talent led to Putin calling them traitors. Unfortunately for him, these traitors disproportionately include professionals in the technology, business, and entertainment industries. It's nothing new, though. The war only accelerated trends that were already happening as soon as the Cold War ended. Now you might realize how much of a contradiction the Russian economy is. Its demographic profile, with an aging and declining population, resembles the world's most developed countries, but its economy looks more like a developing country. And its GDP per capita says as much. But it's even worse depending on where Russians are located. If they're working in Moscow or St. Petersburg, they're classed as one of the lucky ones. The closest they get to Ukraine is through the slanted news reports they hear every day. But Russia is more than just Moscow and St. Petersburg. It's extraordinarily diverse. Unfortunately, this diversity is the product of a pretty dark history. Russia threw off Mongol rule and expanded rapidly between the 16th and 19th centuries. But its reach into these far-flung and sparsely populated regions came with a problem. These places were distant from the Russian heartland, and Moscow naturally questioned their loyalty. So, it had a solution. Take out a map of Russia's major road networks, and something will stand out. While the European heartland is well connected, Siberia remains largely isolated. With few exceptions, it's more closely linked to Moscow via the Trans-Siberian Highway than it is to most regions east of the Ural Mountains. It is very hard to be a minority in Russia. While the media presented each morning is largely the same across the country, for many minorities, especially those living in remote regions, basic mobility is a serious challenge. Road infrastructure is often limited or unpaved, particularly in Siberia. To be fair, this is partly due to the harsh and unforgiving climate. Some towns are inaccessible by road because they're under ice and snow for most of the year. But it's not just the climate that makes life hard. The Russian Far East might be remote, but it has fantastic resources. There's hydrocarbons, iron ore, gold, silver, and 544 million acres, 220 million hectares of farmland. But the area only provides about 5% of the national GDP, so getting a good job in those industries is difficult. Most people leave the region in search of better jobs in Moscow or St. Petersburg. It's no surprise that the Russian Far East has lost a third of its population since the end of the Cold War. But that doesn't always bring the promise of a better life. In Moscow or St. Petersburg, job openings contain words like "only for Slavs" or "seeking candidates of Slavic appearance." The same goes for the housing market, so it becomes not only hard to find a job, but also find a place to stay. Of course, Russian law bans ethnic discrimination in hiring, but it also guarantees freedom of speech, and that doesn't mean anything. Even government entities break the supposed law. Documents from the city of Dzerzhinsk, an important place in Russia's chemical industry, found that the local government explicitly asked that potential contractors be of Slavic appearance. The war in Ukraine seems to have made this problem worse. The Sova Center, a group that monitors extremism in Russia, reported a sharp increase in ethnic-based violence starting in the spring of 2023. The uptick reversed a 20-year trend of decline. Victims of non-Slavic appearance were most frequently targeted in hundreds of attacks by youth gangs. And the violence escalated through 2024, with perpetrators using weapons like knives and brass knuckles. The number of victims is still far lower than in the mid-2000s, but look at the chart and you won't be able to avoid seeing the trend. Many of Russia's minorities have long viewed military service as one of the few available paths forward. And this was true even before the war in Ukraine. While ethnic Russians make up around 80% of the population, the demographic makeup of the military tells a different story. In the summer and autumn of 2022, Ukraine launched successful counteroffensives, reclaiming large areas of territory in Kharkiv and Kherson oblasts. In response, Vladimir Putin issued partial mobilization orders, calling up men from Russia's military reserves. But the mobilization wasn't evenly distributed. Although 77% of Russians live in the European heartland, including cities like Moscow and St. Petersburg, those areas were largely spared. The burden of mobilization fell disproportionately on ethnic minorities and residents of remote regions, continuing a long-standing pattern of inequality within the armed forces. The trend became clear by the end of 2023, the first full year of mobilization. 6 of the 10 Russian regions with the highest known mortality rates are in Siberia and the Russian Far East. Men from the Republic of Buryatia were much more likely to die than men from Moscow, and not by 2 or 3 or even 10 times, but by 75. 18% of the war's total casualties came from this tiny, far-flung place. How many people actually live in Buryatia? The 2021 census recorded it at about 972,000. Moscow's population alone was 12.7 million. With limited social support infrastructure and widespread ethnic discrimination in everyday life, suicide rates in many of Russia's outlying districts remain significantly higher than the national average, despite a general downward trend. The Russian government naturally isn't transparent with its data, but available analysis paints a grim picture. In 2017, male suicide rates reached 30.9 in the Far Eastern District, 31.1 in the Republic of Sakha, and 40 in the Amur region. The lowest rate was 27.8 in the Kamchatsky region. Despite facing systemic inequality and lower GDP per capita compared to regions like the Russian Far East, the North Caucasus reports a significantly lower suicide rate than the national average. While still high by global standards at 11 per 100,000, it's less than half of the most suffering places in Russia, significantly lower than the neighboring Southern Federal District, where nearly 84% of the population is ethnically Russian. So, what's going on? For many Russian soldiers, wounded, disillusioned, and alienated by the colder reception in major cities, returning to their home regions is often the only viable path. These areas, though economically underdeveloped, offer a sense of social cohesion and cultural familiarity that is increasingly scarce elsewhere in the country. Veterans returning to these communities may also benefit from state pensions, providing a modest but crucial measure of financial stability. In fact, payments to the families of deceased or injured soldiers accounted for 6% of Russia's budget in 2024. Yet for many returning veterans, reintegration into civilian life remains a profound challenge. The economy in their home regions is still underdeveloped, offering limited opportunities and little hope for upward mobility. Daily life is saturated with state propaganda about the war in Ukraine, leaving little mental respite. Accessing foreign media, one of the few potential escapes, is increasingly restricted and often burdensome. Amid the isolation and monotony, one constant remains readily available in every home: vodka. Alcohol abuse is so widespread among Russian troops that Russia had to ban them from buying any. The issue extends beyond the battlefield. The Far Eastern Federal District has Russia's highest rate of alcohol consumption. Vodka holds a uniquely prominent place in Russian culture, more than any other national product. And this isn't a lazy stereotype. Russians are the world's leading consumers of vodka by far. The average monthly consumption is 17.28 shots per person, and those shots make up 75% of the nation's total alcohol consumption. Poland comes in at a distant second with 13.71. You've seen this often enough in your subjective experiences, but now you're beginning to know the true scope of the problem. Russia has the world's highest rate of alcoholism. 16.3% of the country's men and 2.6% of the country's women are alcoholics. And this has led to high death rates in general. Go deeper into time, and these rates almost perfectly correlate to the level of alcohol consumption. When alcohol use dipped in the mid-1980s after Gorbachev cut vodka production, death rates fell. They spiked again after the Soviet Union's collapse and remained high into the mid-2000s, when Putin's government imposed stricter regulations. These measures had success until the COVID-19 pandemic and the invasion of Ukraine sent alcohol use up again. Rampant alcohol abuse is the biggest contributor to Russia's high suicide rate. 74% of male suicide and 83% of female suicide cases had high blood alcohol levels, often in the range of 2 to 3%. Binge drinking has always been a cultural practice in Russia, but there's another aspect of life there that adds fuel to the fire. Many of these suicides are preventable. 70% of the people who commit suicide in Russia suffer from an identifiable mental disorder before they go through with it. So, why do so many of them follow through? They just happened to be born in the wrong country and didn't get any treatment. If you suffer from a mental health disorder like chronic depression, you're more likely to be stigmatized than helped in Russia. Mental health issues there are often seen as somehow self-inflicted. Friends and family think of it that way, but so do doctors and even mental health professionals. And since you're in an underdeveloped rural area, help will be even harder to find. Alcohol is one of the most common ways to cope with economic or psychological distress. That's unfortunate, because 61% of male suicides in Russia involve alcohol alcohol. And men account for many more suicides than women. 30.8 Russian men per 100,000 commit suicide, compared to 5.8 per 100,000 for women. Men are expected to perform their duty for Russia and for their family. That might include not only military service, but also dangerous work, and they're supposed to get on with it. Tamir Hagarov, a leading researcher at the Russian Academy of Sciences Institute of Sociology, said that lack of economic prospects and spiritual emptiness are the leading causes. If the suicide rate is anything to go by, Russia has made progress since the 90s, but Putin's decisions threaten to reverse it all. Data in the coming years will tell us the true story Russians won't get from their own media. Thanks for joining me today. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you want to see more videos like this, then please consider subscribing and turn on notifications. It really does make a difference. Thanks again, and I'll see you next time on MatPack.